but particularly U.S. media, what we heard, and then the facts and the realities on the ground. So without further ado, and one thing I wanted to say is that about 99% of the pictures that you see here today are pictures that I personally took. I really love photography, so these are pictures that I personally took. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think it's very important that everything that you hear today and you see today is actually firsthand. It's not something that I pulled off the internet. It's not something that was on YouTube. It was something that actually was what the reality on the ground as it stood from between February 2nd to February 8th. So we had 3 objectives going into Gaza. Because there were so many allegations during the onslaught, everybody was making proclamations, war crimes and breaches of international humanitarian law. We thought it was very important that we ourselves went and saw the situation on the ground and specifically looked at 3 areas. And each of these areas implicates international law, and if breached, these areas could surmount, or the breach of these areas of law could surmount to war crimes. So the first area was to figure out whether Israel targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure, Palestinian civilian and civilian infrastructure. The second area was to figure out whether Israel used illegal weapons or used legal weapons illegally. And the third area was to obtain healthcare testimonials and see whether Israel actually blocked medical and humanitarian aid during those 22 days. And so I'm going to look at all these 3 areas as I speak tonight about what we saw there on the ground. Before I really go into that, I want to look at actually, just to give you a background of what is Gaza. And I think this is really relevant, especially when you're looking at Israel's reaction. And this really goes into the idea of self-defense and these questions that we're going to be talking about later on. But what is Gaza? So Gaza basically is a tiny strip of land. It's about 1/5 the size of Rhode Island. It's about 140 square miles big or large or whatever. It's about 2 Washington D.C.s put together. It's very, very small. So it's approximately about 25 miles long by 7 to 4.5 miles wide. So 25 miles long, that's, I drove from downtown to get here, and that was, almost 50 some miles. So that's, I would have driven twice the size of Gaza, the length of Gaza to get here. Gaza is surrounded by 40-foot walls, so it's completely imprisoned. It's completely secluded from Israel, from Egypt. And the way to get into Gaza or get out of Gaza, there's 2 main entry and exit points. There's a couple of others, but 2 main ones. The one on the south, Rafah, which connects Gaza to Egypt, and the one in the north, Erez, which connects Israel to Gaza. And these are the 2 main entry and exit points. Now, in this tiny strip of land, there is about 1.5 million people that live there, making it one of the most densely populated areas in the world. And when you go there, you see it. You see buildings, these large buildings with many, many families living there. You go into a household, when we would go into households, you find, about tiny little houses with 10, 15 people staying in the house, and that's just normal. And all over the streets, there's children. There's children everywhere. Actually, in fact, 800,000, about 65% of the population of Gaza is, or something around 60% of the population of Gaza is under the age of 18, which means that they're either minors or children. And again, this is relevant when you're taking into consideration, the reason I'm saying this is relevant when you're taking into consideration how Israel reacted in those 22 days and how much ammunition they dropped on that tiny piece of land. Who is going to be affected most? Children. Half the population are refugees or descendants from 1948. So many of these people that live in Gaza, are actually not from Gaza. Many of them are from what is currently known as Israel. Many of them fled in 1948 or subsequently after 1948. So many people don't even come from Gaza, and many of them have fled once or twice in their lifetimes because of aggressions or whatnot. Gaza itself was occupied in 1967, along with the West Bank. Unlike the West Bank, Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. They had a pullout in 2005. There was about 8,000 settlers that lived in Gaza at that time. So when Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, they basically said, look, we're not occupying them anymore. They're not an occupied people. It's not an occupied territory anymore. The problem with this statement is that in order for them not to be an occupied population, Israel has to basically give them the independence so that they can be a sovereign nation, which they are not. Israel still controls everything. They control their water, they control their electricity, they control their borders, they control their airspace, they control their waters. When we were driving up and down Gaza, we would actually look on the strip of land very close to the ocean. You would look just to the right and there were Navy ships, Israeli Navy ships, only a few miles posted right outside of Gaza. Over the airspace, constantly while we were there. There was helicopters, Apache helicopters, there was drones, Israeli drones. The borders themselves, if people from Gaza want to leave, it's nearly impossible for people from Gaza to leave Gaza. You have to get permission from Israel to leave Gaza, either from Rafah or from Erez, it doesn't matter. Israel still controls the population registry of Gaza. And so, technically, under international law, and basically as what is understood by most international institutions, Gaza is still an occupied population. And again, this is relevant when you're looking at issues of self-defense and an occupied people. And I can talk about that more later. So now that we've kind of gone through some of the 101 on Gaza, I'm going to start talking about, what is codenamed Israel's Operation Cast Lead, which started I don't know why it's not showing. It doesn't matter. It was just a slide that said Israel's Operation Cast Lead, December 27, 2008 to January 18, 2009. So again, I'm going to look again at these assertions, the allegations, assertions that we constantly read in the newspapers and the reality on the ground when you go to Gaza. So the first allegation that I wanted to talk about was this idea that Israel was targeting Hamas militants, that it was very specific, it was very targeted, and it was very proportional, it was very distinguished, etc., etc., etc. Before I talk about that, I really want to talk about two major areas of law where this is relevant. When you look at targeting of civilians and what are the relevant areas of law? And the two relevant areas of law are this idea of proportionality and distinction. So under international law, you have this idea that you have to distinguish between civilians and militants. It's a no-brainer. You should not attack civilians if you're going to engage in warfare. Warfare is okay. There's no problem. Under international law, there's no problem with warfare so long as it's acceptable warfare, so long as it's done in self-defense or whatnot. But there's no problems to engage in warfare. But if you are going to engage in warfare, you have to distinguish between militants and civilians, right? So there's always a problem of collateral damage, where you are hitting a militant, or you're going to hit a militant base, but obviously there's going to be civilians in the way. So is it okay to kill civilians? The idea is that yes, it is. If their civilians are going to be wiped out because of an attack on a militant strategic point, it is okay so long as it's proportional. So if you're trying to wipe out, I'm just giving this an example, you're trying to wipe out 2 Hamas people or 3 Hamas people, and in the process you wipe out 100 civilians. Can you guess, is that proportional or not? Absolutely not. That's totally not proportional, and that's totally not okay. So even if you are trying to do something that's normally acceptable, you have to be proportional, and you have to be able to distinguish between civilians and militants. So allegation: Israel was targeting Hamas militants. From our experience there, and just from the pure numbers that have come out, that's totally not true. Israel definitely targeted civilians, and this is even testimonials. It's actually interesting. After we came back, there was many testimonials that came out in Israeli newspapers themselves, where the soldiers themselves admitted that they were targeting, that they were not differentiating between civilians or militants. And this is stuff that came out in Haaretz, it came out in Marib, it came out then further in the New York Times, in the BBC, and the Los Angeles Times. And again, that wasn't news to me, and that was definitely not news to anybody that had none of the delegates. It wasn't a big shocker. It was only corroborating what we actually heard on the ground when we were there. So this is the case of Khalid Abed Rabbu. Khalid Abed Rabbu, and I'm going to play his video shortly, but Khalid Abed Rabbu, he's a father, and on January 7, 2009, he was in his house with his family. And Israeli soldiers came through, and when you go to Gaza now, you will actually see there's still track marks of the tanks that rolled through these villages and these open fields and into the villages. You see the track marks. And so he was in his home when all of a sudden a couple of tanks came. They came into his village, and basically the tanks